Welcome to the North Carolina Formative Assessment Process, Putting It All Together video. We hope that after you finish reviewing this video, that you will be able to envision how this process could be embedded into the instructional day. The heart of this assessment is children. This assessment was created to improve student learning by looking at the whole child. A strong foundation in academics and content is and will always be important. However, research and common sense tells us that when children are emotionally and physically healthy, they do better in school. Also, when children feel safe and valued by adults, they are more likely to be engaged and motivated. We do know that measuring academic achievement is important, and we're not saying anything different. First, however, we should look at the whole child in our efforts to prepare children for the future. Many educators ask, how does the assessment help me on my rating on Standard 6? Well, we hope we have just answered that, because sometimes you have to address the emotional and physical needs of children to increase motivation and performance. This assessment is nothing new. Every day, good teachers can be seen observing children and taking anecdotal notes, adjusting their instruction to meet children's needs, and using a variety of data to drive their instruction. Before we dive into how this process looks in the school and classroom, let's answer a few questions that teachers frequently ask. One question that we have been asked frequently is, am I teaching the North Carolina Standard Course of Study or the construct progressions? The answer to that question is that you always teach the standards. However, now while you are teaching the standards, you can observe the whole child. The construct progressions are tools that help educators think about children in this holistic way. A second question that is often asked is, will this be another assessment where I'll be observing and questioning students in a one-on-one setting? While there are times when working in a one-on-one setting that is helpful relative to instruction and assessment, this assessment happens in real time. Formative assessment is at the heart of teaching. It's what good teachers already do. So, where and how do educators begin the North Carolina formative assessment process? Before implementing this process in your classroom or school, educators first need to read and familiarize themselves with the construct progressions that will enable educators to look at children in their classrooms holistically. Educators would need time to discuss these progressions in a PLC or grade level meeting prior to beginning the process. But it's also important to recognize that they would also need to continue to discuss this process throughout the year. As educators are growing professionally and learning the construct progressions more deeply, they will do what they normally do, which is plan instructionally for students. After teachers have planned appropriately, then together in a PLC, an instructional leader would guide conversations with teachers and help them think about times in which they may see opportunities to observe children exhibiting one or more of the construct progressions. On many occasions, the opportunities are in the teacher's lesson plans, but they may need guidance onto how to intentionally look for opportunities in these lesson plans. For example, when working with teachers and reviewing their instructional plans, an instructional leader may point out to teachers that evidences could be collected in relation to the grip and manipulation and hand dominance progressions anytime a child is completing a writing assignment. There are also times when children are writing that crossing midline could be observed. It can sometimes be overwhelming to look at more than one construct progression at a time. However, as educators better understand the process, teachers' recognition of the progressions will occur more naturally. Sometimes teachers can collect evidence during a non-academic time. So, an instructional leader may need to help them think about times during the day that an educator could collect evidence of student learning in relation to the construct regressions. For example, an educator could observe students crossing midline in the cafeteria line. Many children will cross midline or avoid crossing midline when reaching for a selection in the cafeteria line. This could be a time that the teacher snaps a picture of 3 children a day over the course of 2 weeks to collect evidence on each child in her classroom. This is just one example of how to collect evidence. However, a teacher would continue to collect data in other settings. For example, a student could be observed in any academic setting where manipulatives are being used, such as when a student might be reaching for a thermometer in a science class or letter tiles in a literacy class. The formative assessment process is ongoing and provides children many opportunities to demonstrate their learning. A teacher could also observe gross motor skills at several informal times during the day. For example, weight distribution could be observed anytime students were walking down the hall. A teacher could also observe stair climbing if stairs are a part of your school structure, or simply by watching children entering or exiting the school bus. The playground is another setting where various gross motor skills can be observed. These construct regressions were created as tools to support educators to look at children in this holistic way and the data that can be collected during instruction. However, thinking about these times together as a group makes it less stressful for an educator. Great teachers are constantly making mental notes about children. Great teachers can tell you about children in a holistic way. Some teachers keep all of this information in their heads, while other teachers record anecdotal notes in some method, as seen here. One of the tools provided to make the process of gathering evidence easier is the North Carolina Formative Assessment Process platform. There is also an app that is another tool to make this process easier. These tools allow educators to capture evidence by typing an anecdotal note or recording the anecdotal note using the audio note component. You can even capture evidence by taking a picture or videoing an observation. Anything completed on the app can then be sent to the platform. After you've captured the evidence on the app or the platform, then you can place that evidence on the progression, which will then begin to help you drive your instruction. So, let's pretend a teacher has collected evidences on emotional literacy on several students during a guided reading lesson. This evidence was gathered by asking students to identify how a character was feeling at different times during the story. After the guided reading lesson, or at another time during the day, the teacher recorded an audio note on what she observed for 3 children. Collecting the evidence falls within one component of the formative assessment process, entitled Eliciting Evidence of Learning. Ideally, as teachers begin this process, they would bring their evidences that were collected to a PLC meeting and discuss the evidences with their colleagues and instructional leader. The group would discuss the skill level to determine which skill on the progression matched the evidence collected at that moment in time. Considering each member's decision as to where and why the evidence was placed on the progression is very helpful to the learning process. For example, if one of the evidences collected on emotional literacy was an anecdotal note that said, Javier is reading a page silently in the book and says to the student sitting beside him, "Look how excited that turtle is." One teacher placed the evidence at skill E, and another teacher placed the evidence at skill F on the progression. Having members of the PLC explain their thinking and having a group discussion is a powerful step toward understanding the progression and looking at children to improve instruction. When the current learning status is identified for each child during the PLC, the educators would have completed another component of the formative assessment process, which is referred to as interpreting the evidence. One thing to remember is that every educator may not place the same evidence at the same skill level on the progression, and that's okay. One of the best things about this process is that it allows teachers to use their professional knowledge and their professional judgment to improve student learning. The next component in the formative assessment process is adapting and responding to learning needs. This component can happen in many different ways depending on what is happening in real time in a classroom. Sometimes a teacher adapts and responds after she or he has interpreted one evidence collected and makes an intentional adjustment in the next day's lesson plans. At the beginning of this process, teachers may need to work through this together in a PLC with an instructional leader guiding them. It would be helpful again for all members of PLC to discuss how they would adapt instruction after reviewing the evidence and providing possible instructional strategies that an educator may use to respond to students. Sometimes teachers adapt and respond in real time during instruction, and they may ask a student a question. This would be the eliciting evidence component of the formative assessment process. As the student responds to the question, everything a teacher needs to know is in the child's facial expression, reaction, or student's answer itself, which provides information regarding the interpretation of the evidence component of the formative assessment process. Sometimes a blank stare, shrug, or a complete look of confusion and frustration tells the educator to adapt and respond in a different way through scaffolding, alternative instruction, questioning, and/or providing descriptive feedback. But sometimes it's just as easy as saying to the child, "Tell me what you need or what's confusing." After an educator receives feedback from a student, then the teacher is able to respond and adapt to each child's learning needs. Once you have adapted and responded to a learner's needs, the next step is to identify where the student is headed by discussing and selecting a learning target. The construct progressions can help you identify the next steps. At the beginning of this process, teachers may need to work through the process together once again. Selecting and communicating clear learning targets is more than writing an "I can" statement on the board and having the students read it together prior to the lesson. Children need to know what they are supposed to learn and helping them understand what success looks like and how this lesson relates to that intention. For example, in a PLC, members were discussing the picture that was taken by a first grade teacher that showed a student holding a pencil with an adapted fisted grip, and the members of the PLC used the fine motor construct progression to identify that the next learning target was for skill B, which reads, uses thumb and finger to manipulate objects with whole arm and increased stability from the shoulder. So, during the next writing lesson, the teacher walks over to the student with the fisted grip and says, "You're doing a great job completing your writing assignments, but I think there's a way for you to hold the pencil that will make it so much easier for you." The teacher begins to show their student how to hold the pencil using his thumb and finger while verbally explaining this process as well. It's really important to share the criteria for success for students in a way that they can hear and see the information, which is the developing criteria for success component of the formative assessment process. Now that we have touched on all 5 of the components of the North Carolina K-3 formative assessment process, it is important to highlight that an educator could start anywhere on the formative assessment process, STAR, depending on how things occurred in real time in his or her classroom. The Office of Early Learning recognizes the significant effort exhibited by teachers every day as they grow in their understanding of children. We realize that teachers are constantly observing and learning about children based on those observations. The North Carolina K-3 formative assessment process developed a procedure and tools to help leverage that information to assist teachers in making sound decisions and in thinking deeply about children in a holistic way to better understand where children are currently functioning and where their learning should go next. As teachers begin to learn a new platform, new content, and a new process, supportive and knowledgeable administrators and colleagues will be extremely helpful to teachers and their efforts in helping children reach challenging and achievable goals. Thank you. We hope this video has been helpful. And remember that the North Carolina formative assessment process is a verb, not a noun.